I'm experiencing some technical issues with the file system right now. Let me provide you with the complete documentary script ready for 11 Labs directly. You can copy this text directly into 11 Labs. On the morning of December 18th, 2025, a Cessna Citation lifted off from Statesville Regional Airport in North Carolina. 9 minutes later, 7 people were dead. Among them, NASCAR legend Greg Biffle, his wife Christina, their 5-year-old son Ryder, and his 14-year-old daughter Emma. A retired Delta captain sat in the left seat. His 20-year-old son occupied the right. What began as a routine flight to Florida became a textbook example of how small decisions compound into catastrophe. The NTSB preliminary report raises more questions than answers, but one thing emerges clearly from the wreckage. Every link in the safety chain had holes, and on this December morning, those holes aligned. The flight should have been unremarkable. Biffle's citation, tail number November 257, Bravo Whiskey, was bound for Sarasota to visit YouTube personality and part-time racer Cletus McFarland. An early birthday celebration, a holiday trip. The aircraft, a 1981 Cessna Citation II, was fully fueled and ready for the 1-hour journey. At the controls was Dennis Dutton, 67 years old, a veteran aviator with an impressive pedigree. He'd served in the Air Force, then spent over 3 decades as a Delta Airlines captain, most recently commanding Airbus A300s on international routes. If you wanted someone to fly your family on a business jet, a Dennis Dutton seemed like the ideal choice. His son Jack sat beside him, a 20-year-old Auburn University aviation student who had just earned his instrument rating a month earlier. Behind them in the cabin sat Biffle and his family, along with family friend Craig Wadsworth. 7 souls heading south for the holidays. What none of them knew was that even before the engine started, the first holes in the Swiss cheese were already open. The problems began during pre-flight. Ground crews noted the jet was fully fueled, standard for the flight ahead, but the left engine didn't start on the first attempt. Eventually it caught, and both engines were running by 9:53 local time. During taxi, the cockpit voice recorder captured a concerning discussion. A thrust reverser indicator light for one of the engines wouldn't illuminate, and after some deliberation, the crew determined the reverser itself was functioning properly, just a faulty indicator. They pressed on. In isolation, this decision made sense. The reverser worked, the light didn't. Experienced pilots make judgment calls like this every day. But this was the first hole. At approximately 10:06, the Citation began its takeoff roll on runway 10. Immediately, Biffle, seated near the cockpit in the cabin, observed something odd. The left engine appeared to be producing more power than the right. He mentioned it might be a gauge issue. Dutton continued the takeoff. This was hole number 2. Not the observation itself, but the pattern it established. Things weren't quite right, but they weren't wrong enough to stop. The aircraft climbed into conditions that would soon deteriorate. At departure, the Statesville reported calm winds, 10 miles visibility, with a broken ceiling at 3,900 feet and overcast at 4,800. Reasonable for VFR operations. Dutton's plan was standard for Part 91 flying. Depart visually, then activate an IFR clearance once airborne. Simple. Routine. Except nothing about this flight would remain routine. As the Citation climbed through 2,000 feet, Jack Dutton attempted to contact Atlanta Center to activate their instrument flight plan. He tried 3 times between 10:08 and 10:10. Each attempt failed. Controllers were busy, their frequency congested with radio traffic. This was hole number 3. Without that IFR clearance, the crew was stuck in the visual world, dependent on seeing the ground to navigate safely. And the weather wasn't going to cooperate for much longer. Around 10:09, as the aircraft descended through 1,500 feet and accelerated to 164 knots, there was discussion about climbing higher, even though they were technically required to remain VFR. Then Biffle noticed something else. A temperature discrepancy between the left and right engine interstage turbine readings. More gauge anomalies, more things that weren't quite right. What happened next transformed a problematic flight into an emergency. At approximately 10:10, Dennis Dutton's voice was captured on the cockpit recorder expressing concern. His altitude indicator wasn't working properly. Other gauges on the left side of the cockpit also appeared unreliable. The Garmin GTN 750 navigation system stopped recording airspeed and heading data. Multiple instruments were failing simultaneously. In the cockpit of a light jet, this is the kind of scenario that dramatically increases workload. You're flying by reference to instruments, but now you can't trust them. Which gauges are reliable, which are lying? The human brain, even one belonging to a 35,000-hour airline captain, struggles to process competing information under time pressure. Dutton made a decision that reveals both his professionalism and the impossible situation developing around him. He transferred control of the aircraft to Jack. At approximately 4,500 feet, the 20-year-old with 175 hours in single-engine Cessnas took the controls of a twin-engine jet experiencing multiple system failures. But here's the critical detail. The right side instruments appeared to be working normally. There was no recorded discussion indicating any malfunctions on Jack's side of the cockpit. Dutton needed functioning instruments to troubleshoot the problem. Jack had them. The logic was sound, but it introduced yet another variable into an already complex equation. And this brings us to what may be the most significant hole of all. Jack Dutton, despite his intelligence and passion for aviation, was not qualified to serve as second-in-command on this aircraft. Federal regulations require specific training and endorsements to act as SIC in a type-certificated aircraft like the Citation. Jack held a private pilot certificate with single-engine land and instrument ratings. He had never flown a multi-engine airplane, but his logbook showed 175.3 total hours as of late November, all in single-engine aircraft. Meanwhile, Dennis Dutton's CE 500 type rating carried a limitation, SIC required. This meant he was not certified to fly the Citation alone. He needed a qualified second-in-command, someone with the proper ratings and training. Neither Jack nor Biffle met those requirements, despite Biffle holding multi-engine and instrument ratings. The flight, from a regulatory standpoint, should never have happened with this crew configuration. This wasn't a minor paperwork issue. It was hole number 4, and it was structural. At some point, Dennis resumed control. The exact moment wasn't captured on the recorder. What we know is that around 10 to 13, the crew began configuring for return to Statesville. That weather was deteriorating. Heavy drizzle had moved in, reducing visibility to 5 miles. The ceiling had dropped to 1,200 feet above the ground. The beautiful December morning was closing in around them. Jack Dutton keyed the radio and transmitted on the common traffic advisory frequency. His words, captured for anyone monitoring Statesville traffic, "We're having some issues here." The understatement is haunting. Dutton requested flaps at 10:13:03, made a right turn to a westerly heading, then called for landing gear extension at 10:13:22. Subsequent cockpit discussions indicated the gear was being configured, but the landing gear indicator lights were not illuminated. Yet another system that wasn't working as it should. Biffle's voice was captured, asking about the alternator. It's a telling moment. He was trying to help, drawing on his own pilot experience to troubleshoot, but the Citation 550 doesn't have alternators. It uses starter generators connected to a different electrical architecture. This wasn't Biffle's aircraft type. He didn't have the system's knowledge to effectively assist. Dennis Dutton acknowledged there was a problem, but never specified what it was or how he intended to address it. Then, according to the NTSB, the audio quality of the cockpit voice recorder deteriorated significantly, later returning to normal. Whatever was affecting the instruments may have been affecting other systems too. As the Citation descended toward runway 28, the crew was finally visual with the airport. Jack confirmed he could see the runway and provided directions to his father. The aircraft was configured for landing, or high gear down, flaps extended. Both engines were producing power. They were almost home. But they were also slow and low, critically low. At 1,240 feet altitude and 114 knots indicated airspeed, the Citation was descending toward the runway threshold. Normal approach speed for a Citation at landing weight is considerably higher. The aircraft was bleeding energy, sinking toward the ground faster than they realized. The first impact point was an approach light structure 29 feet tall, located 1,380 feet from the runway threshold. That's almost a third of a mile short. The Citation struck the light, then continued into additional light structures, trees, and perimeter fencing before coming to rest in the runway overrun area. A post-impact fire consumed most of the fuselage. Investigators found the throttles in the full forward position, suggesting a desperate last-second attempt to arrest the descent or go around. But by then, there was no altitude left to trade for anything. So, what really happened? The preliminary report offers facts but not conclusions. We know instruments failed. We know the crew couldn't reach ATC. We know weather deteriorated. We know the pilot in command was operating outside his certification limitations. We know a 20-year-old with no multi-engine experience was handling a jet during a systems emergency. But why did the instruments fail? What caused the apparent electrical anomalies? Why was the aircraft so slow and so low on final approach? Several theories deserve examination. The first focuses on electrical system failure. The Citation 550's electrical architecture relies on two starter generators feeding left and right main DC buses, which can operate in split mode under certain conditions. If a failure isolated the left bus, it would explain why left side instruments failed while right side instruments remained functional. It might also explain the CVR audio quality issues. Some aviation experts have speculated that a blown fuse in the bus tie circuitry could create exactly this scenario. The question is whether the crew recognized what was happening and knew how to respond. The second theory centers on distraction and workload. Even the most experienced pilots can fall victim to fixation during an emergency. Dennis Dutton spent over 30 years flying complex aircraft, but airline operations include a dedicated crew, extensive procedures, and robust automation. Flying a vintage Citation single pilot, or effectively single pilot given his SIC's inexperience, while troubleshooting cascading failures in deteriorating weather, is a fundamentally different challenge. His attention was divided between flying, diagnosing, communicating, and managing a confused cockpit environment. Somewhere in that workload, basic flying discipline may have suffered. The third theory involves the approach itself. Without a qualified co-pilot and with unreliable instruments, executing a visual approach in marginal conditions becomes exponentially more difficult. The low approach speed suggests the aircraft may have been configured with full flaps rather than approach flaps, which would increase drag and decrease the margin for error. A heavily loaded Citation on a visual approach in poor visibility, the aircraft turned with an inexperienced pilot providing callouts, represents a high-risk profile even without instrument failures. The truth likely involves all three factors, and more. James Reason's Swiss cheese model teaches us that accidents rarely have a single cause. They result from multiple holes in multiple defensive layers aligning at exactly the wrong moment. On December 18th, the holes were everywhere. The first layer, organizational and regulatory, had holes in the form of certification limitations that weren't honored. The second layer, supervision and planning, failed when the crew departed with an unqualified SIC and planned to pick up their IFR clearance in the air rather than on the ground. The third layer, preconditions, included marginal weather, a 44-year-old aircraft with indicator anomalies already present during taxi, and a co-pilot with zero experience in the aircraft type. The fourth layer, the unsafe acts themselves, included continuing the flight despite accumulating discrepancies, troubleshooting systems while hand-flying in IMC, and allowing the approach to become unstabilized. Remove any one of those holes, and this flight might have ended differently. If Jack had held proper SIC qualifications, cockpit resource management might have been more effective. If they'd obtained their IFR clearance before takeoff, controllers would have been tracking them and could have offered assistance. If the weather had remained clear, the visual approach would have been straightforward. If the instruments hadn't failed, there would have been nothing to troubleshoot. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they were fatal. For pilots, the lessons are sobering but essential. First, regulatory requirements exist for reasons that become apparent only when things go wrong. Flying with an unqualified SIC doesn't matter until it matters enormously. Second, cascading failures demand a return to first principles: aviate, navigate, communicate. When systems are failing, the priority is maintaining aircraft control and a safe flight path. Diagnosis can wait until the aircraft is stable. Third, go-arounds are always an option. If an approach isn't stabilized, if you're slow or low, if something doesn't feel right, go around. The runway will still be there. For the aviation community, this accident reinforces hard truths about general aviation safety. The regulations governing Part 91 operations provide flexibility that airline operations don't have. That flexibility allows for innovation and efficiency, but it also creates space for the kind of normalization of deviance that can accumulate unnoticed until catastrophe strikes. 7 people boarded that Citation on a December morning, planning to celebrate life with family and friends. A NASCAR champion who had spent his retirement flying helicopters to rescue flood victims, his wife and children. A retired airline captain and his son who shared his passion for flight. A family friend who worked behind the scenes in the racing world. They deserved better than to become a case study in accident causation. The final NTSB report won't be published for 12 to 18 months. When it arrives, it will offer conclusions about probable cause and contributing factors. It may recommend changes to training, equipment, or regulations. But the fundamental lesson is already clear in the preliminary data. Aviation safety isn't built on heroics. It's built on discipline, on doing the small things right even when they seem unnecessary, on respecting the limits that exist precisely because aviation is unforgiving of complacency. Greg Biffle's legacy extends far beyond his 19 Cup Series victories. In the weeks before his death, he flew relief missions to Hurricane Helene victims, using his helicopter to reach people that ground responders couldn't help. He saved lives. He reminded us that the skills we develop can serve purposes greater than ourselves. The investigation into his final flight will continue. And, perhaps, in understanding what went wrong, we honor those we lost by ensuring their tragedy helps prevent the next one. We owe them that much. And the sky demands nothing less.